The day my husband dragged me into court and tried to erase me as a mother, I thought I was about to lose everything. He stood there confident, demanding my home, my dignity, and my child. Then a small voice rose from the back of the courtroom, my daughter's voice, asking the judge if she could show something no one expected. What happened next flipped power in ways no one saw coming. Before I take you through how it all began, take a moment to support this channel. Drop a comment sharing where you're watching from and follow along so stories like this reach the people who need them most. I'm Amara Collins. I'm 36 years old, and until recently I believed endurance was the same thing as love. The morning everything unraveled began like countless others in our house in Brookhaven Ridge, a quiet suburb polished with trimmed hedges and silent judgment. I had been awake since before sunrise, moving softly through the kitchen, careful not to wake my husband, Darius. The house smelled of detergent and toasted bread, a familiar mix that had once felt comforting but now felt like routine survival. I had learned how to exist quietly in my own home. At exactly 6:15, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Darius appeared in the doorway, dressed immaculately, cufflinks already fastened, tie perfectly aligned. I placed his coffee on the table without being asked. Black. No sugar. Too bitter, he would later say. He didn't look at me when he sat down. "This tastes off," he muttered, scrolling through his phone. "I'll fix it tomorrow," I said automatically. He pushed the plate away after 2 bites. The silence between us was thick enough to press against my chest. "Is Leona awake?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "She's getting ready." Moments later, my 7-year-old daughter ran down the stairs, her backpack bouncing, hair tied neatly the way her father liked. She kissed my cheek, then ran to him. "I'm riding with Daddy today," she said, beaming. He smiled for her. That was the only smile he gave that morning. They left together. The front door shut. The engine started. And the house fell quiet again. I cleaned. I folded. I scrubbed. I told myself that if the floors stayed spotless and meals stayed warm, things might return to the way they used to be. I didn't know then that he was already preparing to remove me from the picture entirely. At noon, I picked Leona up from school. She chatted happily about a spelling test and a gold star sticker, and for a moment I felt normal again. That illusion shattered when a courier knocked on the door. He handed me a thick envelope stamped with a law firm's insignia. No return address, just my name. My hands shook as I opened it. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I couldn't breathe. Darius wasn't just asking for a divorce. He accused me of being an unfit mother, claimed I was emotionally unstable, demanded full custody of my daughter and every asset we owned. By the time I reached the last page, I was on the floor. That was when the front door opened. Darius stepped inside, calm, composed, already victorious. "You planned this," I whispered. "Yes," he said flatly. "And you won't get anything." Then he leaned down, his voice cold and precise. "Even Leona will testify." That was the moment I understood this wasn't a separation. It was a calculated erasure. That night, I didn't sleep. Darius locked himself into the guest room like I was the threat, like I was the unstable one he'd just described on paper. I sat on the edge of Leona's bed long after she drifted into sleep, watching her chest rise and fall, memorizing it as if someone might steal the memory away. He said she would testify. The words replayed in my head until they stopped sounding real. At some point after midnight, I realized something worse than the lawsuit itself. He had already started. The next morning, Darius acted like a devoted father. He packed Leona's lunch, fixed her hair, walked her to the car holding her hand. He didn't look at me once. When Leona asked why my eyes were swollen, he answered smoothly, "Mommy hasn't been feeling well lately." The way he said it, gentle, concerned, made my stomach turn. As soon as they left, panic took over. I searched for lawyers. Every number I dialed led to the same dead end. Consultation fees, retainers, money I didn't have. That's when I opened our joint account. 0. I refreshed the screen again and again, convinced it was a glitch. Then I checked the transaction history. Over months, Darius had drained it methodically, transferring everything into an account I'd never seen. He hadn't just filed for divorce. He'd cut off my oxygen. I ran to the bedroom and opened my jewelry box, the one that held my wedding set, my grandmother's earrings, pieces I thought were safe. It was empty. That was when I broke. I slid down the wall and cried so hard my ribs hurt. Not loud sobs, silent ones, the kind you make when you're afraid, even grief, might be used against you. By late afternoon, desperation pushed me to call an old acquaintance who worked with legal aid. She couldn't represent me, but she gave me a name. Marcus Hale. Small office. Modest fees. He's honest, she said, and he fights. That was all I had. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back slowly and said, "Your husband isn't trying to win. He's trying to bury you." He showed me the evidence Darius had already filed. Photos of a messy house, taken on the 3 days I'd been sick with a fever, so high I could barely stand. Credit card statements in my name, for luxury purchases I'd never made. And then the worst of it, a psychological evaluation, conducted without my knowledge, by someone named Dr. Elaine Roth. The report described me as volatile, emotionally erratic, and harmful to my daughter's development. I didn't know her. I had never met her, but she was prepared to testify under oath. Marcus looked at me carefully. "You need to understand something," he said. "If you lose control in court even once, this report becomes truth." That night, Darius came home early with a box. "A new tablet for Leona," he announced cheerfully. She squealed with excitement. I noticed something he didn't. Her old tablet, the cracked one she'd had since kindergarten, was nowhere to be seen. Days passed like this. Darius undermined me, quietly, corrected my cooking, interrupted when I helped with homework, bought gifts, made comments about how much easier things would be when Daddy handled everything. Leona grew quieter, confused. One night she asked me, "Mommy, are you sick?" "No," I said softly. "Daddy says you get angry a lot." My heart fractured. The night before the trial, I found Leona asleep clutching something under her pillow. The old tablet. I didn't understand why she hid it. I didn't know yet that it held the only truth that mattered. The courtroom the next day felt like a stage built for my execution. Darius sat across from me, calm, confident, already dressed for victory. Beside him sat Dr. Roth, elegant, composed, wearing the same perfume I'd smelled on his shirt weeks earlier. When she testified, the room leaned in. She spoke in clinical language, turning ordinary moments into evidence of instability. A raised voice at a park, a tearful argument, a single bad day reframed as a pattern. When it was my turn to speak, Marcus warned me quietly, "Stay calm, no matter what." I tried, but when Darius's lawyer showed a photo of me crying and called it proof, something snapped. I stood up. I shouted, and I watched the judge's face harden. I had walked straight into their trap. That night, I believed I had already lost my daughter. I didn't know that the smallest person in that courtroom had been watching everything and preparing to speak. I walked out of the courtroom that evening hollowed out, not angry, not hopeful, just emptied. Marcus tried to reassure me in the hallway, but I could barely hear him. The judge had already seen what Darius wanted him to see. A woman pushed past her breaking point. A mother framed as unstable. A child presented as a prize to be rescued. Darius didn't look at me as we left. He didn't need to. In his mind, he had already won. That night, I sat on the floor of Leona's room while she slept, my back against her bed, staring at the soft glow of her nightlight. Every breath she took felt borrowed. I kept imagining a future where her room was empty, where I wasn't there to tuck her in, where my voice became something she only remembered faintly. Around midnight, she stirred. "Mommy," she whispered. "I'm here. I said immediately, crawling closer. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Are you going to be okay? The question almost destroyed me. Yes, I lied gently. Everything will be okay. She studied my face the way children do when they're trying to understand something adults refuse to explain. Then she asked very quietly, if I show something tomorrow, will Daddy be mad? My heart stopped. What do you mean, sweetheart? I asked carefully. She hesitated. Her small fingers reached under the pillow and pulled out the old tablet. The cracked one. The one I'd thought was just sentimental junk. I wasn't supposed to keep this, she said. Daddy said Mommy shouldn't know. My pulse roared in my ears. Know what? I whispered. She shook her head. I don't know, but I recorded it. My hands trembled as I took the tablet from her. What did you record, Leona? Her voice was barely audible. Daddy and the lady. The one who lies. My breath left my body in one sharp gasp. I turned on the tablet with shaking fingers. The battery was low. The screen flickered. And then I saw it. Our living room. The angle was low, tilted slightly like it had been recorded from behind the large potted plant near the couch. Darius walked into frame laughing. Then Dr. Elaine Roth followed. Not dressed like a professional. Not composed. Relaxed. Intimate. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and kissed her neck. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The audio was clear. She's so stupid, Roth said, laughing. She won't even realize what's happening. Darius's voice followed, smug and certain. She won't fight back. No money. No support. And once she explodes in court, the judge will believe everything. Roth's voice again. Your plan is cruel. Darius chuckled. Effective. I felt sick. Leona watched my face closely. I didn't know it was bad, she said quickly. I just thought, Mommy should know. But Daddy said not to tell you. I pulled her into my arms and held her so tightly she squeaked. You did the right thing, I whispered, tears soaking her hair. You did the bravest thing. She nodded, relieved. Can I show the judge? So he doesn't take me away. My entire body shook. Yes, I said. You can. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Darius looked relaxed, already dressed for celebration. Roth sat behind him, confident, her posture flawless. The judge began reading his preliminary conclusions. Every word felt like a nail sealing my coffin. Then it happened. Your Honor, a small voice said. The courtroom froze. I turned. Leona stood near the back, still in her school uniform, clutching the tablet to her chest. A court officer moved instinctively, but the judge raised his hand. Let her speak, he said. Darius's face drained of color. Leona, he hissed. Sit down. She ignored him. She walked forward slowly, her shoes echoing against the marble floor, and stopped in front of the judge. Your Honor, she said again, her voice shaking but steady. Can I show you something? Something my mommy doesn't know. The judge leaned forward. Yes, he said gently. You may. Darius lunged to his feet. I object. This is inappropriate. Sit down, the judge snapped. The clerk connected the tablet to the courtroom monitor. The screen lit up. I couldn't breathe. The video played. Gasps rippled through the room as Darius and Roth appeared on screen, laughing, plotting, confessing. When Darius's voice bragged about provoking me to make me look unstable, the judge's face darkened. When Roth admitted her testimony was designed to fit the plan, someone in the gallery actually swore out loud. Darius shouted for it to stop. The judge slammed his gavel. Continue. The video ended in silence, so thick it felt unreal. Roth tried to stand. Officers restrained her. Darius looked at me for the first time in weeks. There was no arrogance left. Only fear. The judge didn't hesitate. All prior testimony is struck from the record, he said coldly. Full custody is granted to the mother. All assets are frozen pending criminal investigation. I dropped to my knees as Leona ran into my arms. I hadn't lost. I had survived. And my daughter had saved us both. The courtroom didn't erupt the way people imagine moments like that do. There was no shouting, no applause, no dramatic music swelling in the background. There was just silence. Heavy, stunned silence. I stayed on my knees with my arms wrapped around Leona, my face pressed into her shoulder, breathing her in like I had almost lost the right to do so. My body shook uncontrollably, not from fear this time, but from the sudden release of it. The judge spoke again, his voice cutting through the stillness. Court is in recess. Officers escort Mr. Hale and Dr. Roth from the courtroom immediately. Darius tried to speak. He opened his mouth like he still believed words could save him. They couldn't. 2 officers took him by the arms. He didn't resist at first. He just stared at the screen, still black, still holding the image of his own voice condemning him. When they pulled him toward the aisle, he finally turned and looked at me, not with anger, with disbelief, as if he still couldn't understand how the version of me he had dismissed as weak had survived him. Elaine Roth broke down completely. The composed professional image cracked into something raw and ugly. She cried, protested, begged the judge to reconsider, claimed she had been manipulated. The judge didn't look at her. Save it for the prosecutor, he said flatly. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder. Amara, he said softly. It's over. But it wasn't. Not yet. Outside the courtroom, everything moved fast. Too fast. Reporters appeared from nowhere. Questions flew like darts. How does it feel? Did you know your daughter was recording? Do you forgive your husband? I shielded Leona with my body and didn't answer a single one. We were escorted through a side exit. Marcus guided us into his car, closed the door, and only then did I finally let myself cry out loud. Leona climbed into my lap and wrapped her arms around my neck. I was scared, she whispered, but I didn't want to leave you. I kissed her hair over and over again. You never will, I promised. Never. The next few days blurred together. Police interviews, statements, evidence reviews. The tablet was taken as evidence, but copies were made immediately. The video wasn't just damning, it was catastrophic. Darius hadn't just plotted to ruin me. He had confessed to theft, fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. The joint account transfers were traced. Every dollar he had siphoned off was documented. The psychologist board was notified. Elaine Roth's license was suspended within 48 hours, pending criminal charges. Darius's lawyer resigned. Smart move. The house, our house, was placed under temporary protection orders. Darius wasn't allowed within 500 feet of me or Leona. The first night back home felt surreal. I slept on the couch with Leona curled against me, neither of us ready to be alone in separate rooms yet. I woke repeatedly, checking that she was still there, still breathing, still mine. She slept peacefully. I didn't. The following week, the criminal charges were formalized. Fraud, perjury, financial abuse, psychological manipulation, evidence tampering. The words felt unreal when I heard them read aloud. This was the same man who once complained my coffee was too bitter. Now he was facing years behind bars. Marcus walked me through the next steps, slowly, carefully. Divorce proceedings reopened, this time on my terms. Emergency custody orders finalized. Asset recovery initiated. For the first time in months, the ground stopped shifting beneath my feet. But relief came with something else. Anger. Not the explosive kind. The quiet, simmering kind that arrives when you realize how calculated the harm was. Darius hadn't snapped. He had planned. He had studied me. Not to love me, but to dismantle me efficiently. That realization hurt more than the betrayal. Leona stayed home from school for a few days. I told her teachers everything they needed to know, without details that would scar her. They were kind, gentle, protective. One afternoon, while she colored at the kitchen table, she looked up at me. "Mommy." "Yes, sweetheart." "Was Daddy always bad?" The question pierced me. I sat across from her and chose my words carefully. "No," I said honestly, "but he made very bad choices." "Is he mad at me?" "No," I said firmly. "None of this is your fault. You did the right thing." She nodded slowly, absorbing it the way only children can, without overthinking, without guilt. That night, after she fell asleep, I stood alone in the living room. The same room from the video, the same couch, the same plant, the same walls that had witnessed lies whispered in confidence. I didn't cry. I opened the windows and let the air in. I needed the space to breathe again. Within 2 weeks, the house felt too heavy to stay in. Every corner echoed with memories I didn't want to reclaim. With Marcus's help, I arranged for a temporary apartment across town. Smaller, brighter, neutral, a place without ghosts. The day we moved, Leona skipped through the empty rooms, deciding where her bed would go, where her books would live. "This one feels happier," she declared. She was right. The criminal case moved forward steadily. Darius's face appeared briefly on the news. Handcuffed, head down, escorted into a courthouse. I turned the TV off. I didn't need to watch him fall. I needed to rise. That evening, after dinner, Leona climbed into my lap and held my face between her hands. "Mommy," she said seriously, "I didn't mean to be brave." I smiled through tears. "That's usually how it works." She giggled, then yawned, resting her head against my chest. As she slept, I understood something clearly for the first time since this nightmare began. I wasn't just a woman who had been wronged. I was a mother who had been tested and protected by the very child she had raised with love and patience. And that realization changed everything. Freedom doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in fragments. In the first few days after leaving the house, I kept expecting someone to tell me it wasn't real, that custody could still be reversed, that some hidden clause would surface and pull Leona away from me again. I slept lightly, waking at every sound, my body still trained for danger. But morning after morning, Leona was still there. She brushed her teeth at the small bathroom sink of our new apartment, humming softly. She ate cereal on the floor because we hadn't bought a table yet. She laughed at things that had nothing to do with survival. Slowly, my nervous system began to catch up with reality. Marcus stayed in constant contact. Every call brought updates, asset recovery, account freezes, court schedules. Darius's financial web was unraveling faster than even Marcus expected. His arrogance had been his greatest weakness. He had assumed I would never fight back, never question, never document. The transfers to Elaine Roth's account were only the beginning. There were shell accounts, hidden tax discrepancies, a pattern of financial manipulation that extended beyond our marriage. Once investigators started pulling at the threads, everything began to loosen. The word predatory appeared in one of the preliminary reports. I read it twice. That word didn't just describe what he had done to me. It described who he had always been. The divorce proceedings reopened, formally 3 weeks later. This time, Darius wasn't sitting across from me. He appeared via video from a holding facility, wearing a wrinkled uniform, his face thinner, his posture collapsed. I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, just distance. When the judge granted the divorce on grounds of fraud, coercive control, and adultery, I didn't smile. I simply exhaled. The house sale closed shortly after. The funds, my funds, were deposited into a new account under my sole name. Seeing that balance felt surreal. For years, I had been treated like a dependent, someone incapable of managing anything beyond groceries. Now I was rebuilding my life line by line. Leona returned to school full-time. Her teachers kept an eye on her gently, not hovering, but aware. She adjusted faster than I expected. Children, I learned, don't cling to places, they cling to safety. And she finally had it again. One afternoon, as we walked home together, she looked up at me and said, "Mommy, I like it when you smile like this." "Like what?" I asked. "Like you're not scared anymore." I stopped walking. I knelt down in front of her, my hands on her shoulders. "I'm still learning," I said honestly. "But I promise you this. I will never let anyone hurt us again." She nodded, satisfied, and skipped ahead. That promise became my compass. I started small. I reopened an old email account tied to my professional life, the one I'd abandoned when Darius insisted I stay home, just for a while. Messages flooded in from former colleagues who had assumed I'd chosen silence. I hadn't. I'd been isolated. I reached out cautiously at first, reconnecting, explaining gaps without oversharing. Opportunities surfaced slowly, consulting projects, remote work, flexible hours. The first contract I signed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd thought was gone forever. I worked late one night while Leona slept, surrounded by unpacked boxes, spreadsheets glowing on my laptop. For the first time in years, exhaustion felt earned, not imposed. The criminal trial loomed in the background like a storm cloud. I wasn't required to testify again. The video had already done most of the work, but I prepared anyway. I refused to be unready ever again. Elaine Roth pleaded not guilty. Darius didn't. That detail mattered. He had tried to shift blame onto her, claiming she manipulated him, but his own recorded words made that impossible. The prosecution moved swiftly. The media interest died down faster than I expected. New scandals replaced ours. The world moved on. We didn't. Healing doesn't trend. It happens quietly. Some nights, memories crept in uninvited. The sound of Darius's voice, the way he'd stood in court pretending concern. On those nights, I didn't force myself to be brave. I let the fear surface, then pass. Leona slept peacefully through all of it. One evening, I found her sitting on her bed with the old tablet in her lap. "Can I keep it?" she asked. "Yes," I said immediately. "That belongs to you." She smiled and hugged it to her chest, not because it was evidence anymore, but because it represented something else now. Agency. A few weeks later, Marcus invited us to his office. Not for legal matters. For closure. He handed Leona a small certificate, nothing official, just something he'd made himself. It read, "For extraordinary courage." Leona blushed. "Does this mean I'm famous?" she whispered. Marcus laughed. "It means you're brave." She thought about that, then nodded solemnly. On the way home, she asked me something unexpected. "Mommy, if Daddy ever says sorry, do I have to forgive him?" I didn't answer right away. "No," I said finally. "Forgiveness is a choice. And sometimes the bravest choice is protecting yourself." She seemed to accept that. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat by the window and realized something profound. The story wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to disappear. Darius had tried to rewrite reality, to paint me as unstable, unreliable, expendable. He had almost succeeded. But truth has weight, and once it's placed in the open, it crushes lies effortlessly. I didn't know yet what the next chapter would look like, but for the first time I knew who was writing it. There is a strange silence that follows survival, not the peaceful kind, the kind that leaves too much room for memory. Once the urgent battles were over, the court orders signed, the accounts secured, the locks changed, I was left alone with myself in a way I hadn't been for years. For a long time, every decision I made had been shaped by avoidance. How not to upset Darius, how not to appear difficult, how not to trigger another cold withdrawal of affection or another quiet punishment disguised as indifference. Now there was no one to manage, and that freedom was heavier than I expected. Some mornings I woke up already tired, not from work or stress, but from the effort of unlearning habits that had once kept me safe. I had to remind myself I was allowed to speak at a normal volume, that I didn't need permission to buy something small. That silence was no longer a warning sign. Leona adapted faster than I did. She began filling the apartment with noise, singing while she dressed, narrating her drawings, asking questions that had nothing to do with courtrooms or judges. Sometimes she asked about the future in ways that caught me off guard. Will we always live here? Can we get a cat? Do you think I'll be tall? Her questions were rooted in continuity. That alone told me she felt safe. I started therapy at Marcus's suggestion, though I didn't think I needed it at first. I told myself I was fine. I had survived. I had won. I was functional. The therapist listened quietly, then said something that landed harder than any accusation ever had. You learn to disappear to stay alive. That sentence rewired something in me. I hadn't been weak. I had been adaptive. And now I needed to adapt again. The sessions were uncomfortable. We didn't focus on Darius at first. We focused on me, on the parts of myself I'd minimized, apologized for, or buried because they didn't fit into the role I was assigned. I learned how often I softened my language, even now. How I framed preferences as suggestions. How I still waited for disapproval that never came. Naming those patterns didn't erase them immediately, but it gave me leverage. Meanwhile, the criminal case moved forward relentlessly. Darius accepted a plea deal, reduced time in exchange for full cooperation. He named names, admitted everything, signed documents without resistance. Elaine Roth didn't. She fought harder, clinging to the version of herself that had once commanded respect. Her trial was scheduled separately, and for months her name hovered in the background like unfinished business. I didn't attend every hearing. I didn't need to, but I stayed informed. One afternoon, I received a call from the prosecutor's office. They needed clarification on a detail in the video. Context, tone, timeline. I answered calmly, efficiently. After I hung up, I sat in silence, realizing how far I'd come. There was a time when hearing Darius's name had made my chest tighten. Now it was just information. Leona continued thriving. Her teacher sent home notes praising her focus and creativity. She joined an art club. She made friends easily. No signs of withdrawal. No behavioral issues. Children are often described as resilient, but what they really are is responsive. Given safety, they bloom. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, real dinner, not rushed survival meals, Leona asked if she could help cut vegetables. I hesitated. Then I handed her a dull knife and guided her hands. We moved slowly, deliberately. Trust built not from control, but from shared attention. Later that night, she asked if we could frame the certificate Marcus had given her. Why? I asked gently. So I don't forget, she said. In case I'm scared again. I framed it the next day. Not because she needed the reminder. Because I did. Work stabilized. My consulting contracts grew into steady engagements. I set boundaries without apology, declining meetings that conflicted with school pickup, charging what my time was worth. No one argued. That surprised me. It turns out the world doesn't collapse when you stop shrinking. The divorce settlement finalized quietly. Darius's name was removed from everything that mattered. The last legal tie dissolved with a judge's signature and a muted click of a pen. I expected to feel something when it happened. Relief, anger, closure. Instead, I felt neutral. That neutrality was powerful. It meant he no longer occupied space inside me. The day Darius was formally sentenced, I was at the park with Leona. My phone buzzed with the notification. I glanced at it once, then slipped it back into my pocket. Leona was laughing on the swings, pumping her legs higher and higher. I pushed her gently, timing my steps with her movement. She shouted, "Higher!" And I laughed, not because justice had been served, but because life was moving forward again. That night, after she fell asleep, I allowed myself to grieve, not the marriage, but the years I had lost to fear. I didn't romanticize them. I didn't rewrite them. I simply acknowledged them. Then I let them go. I stood by the window and looked out over the city lights, thinking about the woman I had been when this story began. She had been quiet. She had been careful. She had believed endurance was the same as love. I understood her now, and I forgave her, because she had done the best she could with the information she had. And when she learned better, she acted. That was not weakness. That was strength delayed, not denied. I didn't know yet what the next chapters would bring. There were still legal echoes, still emotional work ahead. But I knew this much with certainty. No one would ever tell my story for me again. And no one would ever mistake my silence for submission. Time stopped feeling like an enemy. That realization came slowly, the way healing often does. Not as a breakthrough moment, but as the absence of urgency. Weeks passed without court dates circled in red on my calendar. Days unfolded without legal calls interrupting dinner. Nights arrived without the familiar dread of what tomorrow might bring. I didn't trust it at first. Trauma teaches you that calm is temporary. The disaster is simply resting before its next appearance. For a long time, I stayed alert even in peace, scanning for danger that wasn't there. But eventually, something inside me softened. I began making plans again. Not survival plans. Real ones. Leona and I painted one wall of the apartment a warm shade of yellow because she said it looked like morning feels. We bought mismatched furniture from thrift stores and laughed about how nothing matched except us. I hung my diplomas back on the wall, not as trophies, but as reminders of who I had always been. For years, I had allowed my life to shrink until it fit inside someone else's comfort. Now it was expanding again. I started running in the mornings. Not for fitness, not to punish my body, but to feel it move with intention. The first few times were hard. My breath came shallow, my muscles protested, my thoughts raced ahead of me. But with each step, something loosened. I was no longer running from anything. I was running toward myself. The criminal case against Elaine Roth reached its peak late that summer. I was called in briefly, not to testify, but to verify context and authenticity of the recording. Sitting in the sterile interview room, I felt strangely detached, as if I were assisting with someone else's story. She pleaded guilty in the end. Her sentence was shorter than Darius's, but the consequences were absolute. Her license was revoked permanently. Her reputation collapsed overnight. The professional identity she had built so carefully vanished. When the news reached me, I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure. Leona asked about it once. "Is the lady going away too?" she asked while brushing her teeth. "Yes," I said simply. "Okay," she replied, satisfied. "Can we go to the library tomorrow?" That was how children process justice, not as a spectacle, but as resolution. I admired that. Work grew steadily. I was invited to consult on a larger project, then another. People listened when I spoke. They valued my insights. I found myself sitting at tables where decisions were made, real ones, not symbolic gestures. No one questioned my competence. The thought struck me one afternoon, sharp and unexpected. They never had. Darius had needed me to believe I was less. The world had not. That understanding shifted something fundamental in me. I stopped explaining myself preemptively. I stopped apologizing for clarity. I stopped framing boundaries as compromises. And the strangest thing happened. People respected me more. Leona noticed the change before I did. One evening, as we folded laundry together, she said, "Mommy, you talk different now." "How?" I asked. "Like you know things," she said thoughtfully. "And you don't look at the floor anymore." I smiled. "I've always known things," I said. "I just forgot for a while." That fall, we visited my parents for the first time since everything happened. I had delayed it, unsure of how much to share, uncertain whether I could handle their reactions. But when we arrived, my mother hugged me tightly and whispered, "You're home." Not the house. Me. We talked late into the night after Leona fell asleep. I told them everything, what I had endured, what I had learned, what I had lost and regained. My father listened silently, his jaw tight. My mother cried softly, not out of pity, but recognition. "We didn't see it," she said, "but we see you now." That mattered. Returning to the apartment afterward, I felt lighter, as if another piece of the story had settled into place. The holidays came quietly that year. No large gatherings, no forced cheer, just simple rituals we created ourselves, baking cookies, decorating a small tree, reading together before bed. On Christmas Eve, Leona handed me a folded piece of paper. "I made you something," she said shyly. It was a drawing of the two of us, holding hands under a bright sun. Above our heads, she had written in uneven letters, "We are safe." I pressed the paper to my chest and cried, not because of what we had escaped, but because of what we had built. That winter, I received a letter from Darius. It came through his attorney, heavily filtered, sanitized of emotion. He expressed regret, claimed he had been under pressure, suggested therapy had helped him understand his mistakes. He asked, carefully, indirectly, whether I might consider allowing supervised contact with Leona someday. I read the letter once. Then I put it away. Not forever, but not yet. I discussed it with my therapist, with Marcus, with myself. There was no rush, no obligation, no deadline. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not a prerequisite for peace. Protection was. Leona never asked about him again. Spring returned, bringing with it a sense of momentum. We planted flowers on the balcony. I signed a longer-term contract that secured our finances comfortably. I bought a second-hand piano and enrolled Leona in lessons because she showed interest, not because it looked good on paper. One evening, as she practiced hesitantly, missing notes but smiling anyway, I sat on the couch and realized something quietly profound. I was happy. Not in the loud, performative way happiness is often portrayed, but in the steady, grounded way that feels sustainable. The kind that doesn't demand sacrifice. The kind that doesn't require silence. The past hadn't disappeared. It never would, but it no longer defined the present. I had stopped measuring my worth by someone else's approval. I had stopped confusing endurance with love. And most importantly, I had stopped waiting for permission to exist fully. Leona finished her song and looked at me expectantly. "How was it?" she asked. I stood and applauded. "It was perfect," I said honestly. She beamed. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. The story wasn't ending. It was evolving. The longer I lived without fear, the more clearly I could see it for what it had been. Fear isn't loud at first. It doesn't announce itself as danger. It disguises itself as compromise, as patience, as loyalty, as love that asks you to make yourself smaller just for now. Once that illusion breaks, it never quite reforms the same way again. Leona and I settled into rhythms that felt natural rather than forced. Mornings were unhurried. Evenings were quiet without being tense. I no longer felt the need to fill silence with explanations or reassurance. Silence had stopped being something to survive. It had become space. Space for thought, for choice, for growth. I stopped flinching when my phone rang unexpectedly. I stopped checking over my shoulder in parking lots. I stopped rehearsing arguments that never came. And slowly, I stopped narrating my life as if it were always one step away from collapse. One afternoon, while reorganizing paperwork I no longer needed but hadn't yet had the courage to discard, I found the original divorce petition Darius had filed. The words still stung, but not in the same way. They felt distant, like a script written for someone I barely recognized. Emotionally unstable, incapable, unfit. I read the pages carefully, not to punish myself, but to understand the mechanics of the lie. Every accusation had been precise, targeted, designed to trigger doubt rather than outrage. That realization mattered, because it meant what he had done wasn't impulsive cruelty. It was strategic erasure. I shredded the papers slowly, page by page, letting the fragments fall into the bin. I didn't need proof anymore. I needed release. Work took me into rooms filled with people who spoke confidently about risk, strategy, leadership. I listened differently now. I noticed patterns, who interrupted whom, who softened their language unnecessarily, who claimed credit for ideas that weren't theirs. I spoke when it mattered. And when I did, the room listened. That was new. Not because I had suddenly become competent, but because I had stopped questioning whether I deserved to be heard. Leona thrived in ways that surprised even her teachers. Her creativity flourished. Her curiosity sharpened. She asked complex questions about fairness, honesty, and choices. One night, while we were brushing our teeth side by side, she asked, "Mommy, how do you know when someone is lying?" I paused. "That's a big question," I said. She nodded seriously. "I think you know because your stomach feels weird." I smiled softly. "You're right," I said. "Your body often knows before your brain does." She seemed pleased with that answer. Then she added, "Daddy's stomach must feel very weird all the time." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because she didn't need an answer. She needed confirmation that she could trust her instincts. And she could. That summer, Marcus invited us to a small gathering at his home. Nothing formal. Just people who had been part of the long road. Friends, colleagues, a few families. I hesitated before going. Public spaces still carried echoes of judgment for me. Even now, part of me expected someone to ask the wrong question or draw the wrong conclusion. But no one did. They talked about books, travel, projects, children, normal things. Leona ran around laughing with other kids, free of the weight she had carried without ever being told she was carrying it. Watching her, I realized something important. She wasn't defined by what she had witnessed. She was defined by what she had learned. Courage, discernment, love without fear. Late that evening, Marcus pulled me aside. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been doing this a long time. Most people never really recover from something like what you went through." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" He smiled. "It's supposed to be honest. You didn't just recover. You recalibrated." That word stayed with me. Recalibrated. It suggested intention, adjustment, agency. As the year turned, I began mentoring younger women in my field, not formally, not as a program, just conversations. Coffee meetings, honest advice, warnings delivered without cynicism. I didn't tell my story outright. I didn't need to. I shared lessons instead. Pay attention when someone minimizes you. Control disguised as concern is still control. Love doesn't require you to disappear. The impact surprised me. One woman emailed me months later to say she had ended an engagement that didn't feel right. Another thanked me for helping her negotiate her salary without apology. I never framed it as empowerment. I framed it as permission. Leona noticed the change in our home too. We talked openly now about emotions, boundaries, respect. One evening she said, "Mommy, if someone is nice but makes you sad, that's not good, right?" "That's right," I said. "Kindness shouldn't hurt." She nodded thoughtfully and returned to her drawing. I realized then that the most powerful thing I had done wasn't winning in court. It was breaking the pattern. There were still moments of grief. They came quietly, usually when I least expected them. A song on the radio, a memory triggered by a place. The version of myself that might have existed if none of this had happened. I let those moments come. I didn't rush them away. Grief doesn't mean you want the past back. It means you acknowledge what it cost. And that acknowledgement is part of healing. One evening, I finally read the rest of Darius's letter, the one I had set aside months earlier. I read it carefully, without anger, without hope. It was full of self-reflection, apologies, requests, but it lacked one crucial thing: accountability without expectation. He wanted relief, not repair. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Maybe someday I would respond. Maybe not. That decision belonged to me now. Leona fell asleep one night on the couch while we were watching a documentary about space. I carried her to bed carefully, tucking her in the way I had done hundreds of times before. As I turned off the light, she murmured, half asleep, "Mommy?" "Yes." "I'm glad you listened to me." My throat tightened. "So am I whispered. I closed her door gently and stood in the hallway, letting the moment settle. Listening. That had been the turning point. Not shouting, not fighting, listening to the truth when it whispered, and trusting myself enough to act on it. I walked back into the living room and sat quietly, the city lights glowing beyond the window. The story wasn't finished yet, but it was finally mine to tell. Time has a strange way of revealing things you didn't know you were still carrying. I believed I had healed because the fear no longer ruled my days, because the courtrooms were behind me, because my home was quiet again, because Leona laughed without hesitation, because I could breathe. But healing isn't the absence of pain. It's the ability to notice it without being consumed. The first sign came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was in a conference room reviewing a long-term acquisition proposal when a junior associate asked a simple question. Polite, thoughtful, genuinely curious. I opened my mouth to answer, then froze. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because for a split second, my mind replayed something old. "You're overthinking. You always do." It wasn't spoken aloud, but it echoed. I caught myself before it settled. I answered clearly, confidently. The room moved on. No one noticed the moment except me. That's how the past works when it loses its power. It whispers instead of shouts. And whispers can still wound if you're not paying attention. Later that evening, while Leona worked on a school project at the dining table, she asked if she could use my laptop to look up images for her presentation. I hesitated automatically, an instinct I didn't realize was still there. Then I nodded. "Of course." She smiled, took the laptop and got to work. The hesitation lingered. Not because I didn't trust her, because for years, technology in my home had been a tool used against me. Photos taken without context, videos edited without consent, evidence manufactured. I watched Leona type carefully, her tongue poking out in concentration, and felt a quiet sadness for the version of myself who had lived surrounded by invisible traps. That version of me had survived, but she deserved to be acknowledged. A few weeks later, I received a call I hadn't expected. It was from an unfamiliar number. I didn't answer. They left a voicemail. It was brief, professional, measured. It was a detective. They were reopening parts of Darius's case. New information had surfaced. I sat on the couch, listening to the message twice. Then a third time. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was fatigue. I had already paid the price. I had already testified. I had already rebuilt. I had already moved forward. Why did the past keep finding ways to knock? I called Marcus. He listened without interrupting. Then he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes accountability doesn't arrive on schedule. But when it does, it doesn't ask whether you're done. I met with the detective a week later, not because I wanted to relive anything, but because I refused to hide from it. They explained that during an unrelated investigation, financial records had surfaced, older ones, transfers that hadn't been fully examined at the time of the divorce, accounts that had been masked under shell entities, transactions that pointed to deliberate concealment. It wasn't just personal betrayal. It was systematic fraud. The detective didn't dramatize it. They didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Context," they said. "Patterns. Anything you remember that didn't make sense at the time." I thought about the missing funds, the sudden urgency, the pressure, the narrative he'd tried to construct around my supposed instability. And something clicked. It hadn't just been about custody. It had been about control, about distraction, about ensuring I never looked too closely. I gave them what I could. When I left the station, the sun felt too bright. The street too loud. Not because I was afraid. Because I was tired of being brave. That night, Leona noticed I was quiet. She climbed into my lap without asking. We sat there for a long time, neither of us speaking. "You're safe," she said suddenly. I looked down at her. "What makes you say that?" She shrugged. "Because you're here." I held her tighter. Children don't understand legal systems or investigations, but they understand presence. Weeks passed. The investigation continued quietly in the background, like distant thunder. Not immediate, not disruptive, but unmistakably there. At work, I was offered a leadership role I hadn't applied for. When I asked why, my supervisor said, "You're steady under pressure. People trust you. That matters." I accepted, not because it felt like validation, but because it felt aligned. Leona adjusted to the new routine easily. She always did. One evening, while organizing old files to prepare for the investigation, I found something unexpected. A small notebook tucked into a drawer I hadn't opened in years. It was mine. I had written in it during the final months of my marriage. Not regularly, just fragments. Questions, doubts, sentences that ended without punctuation. Reading it was like meeting someone who had been drowning, quietly. "Why do I feel guilty all the time?" He says I'm too sensitive. Maybe I am. I can't tell if I'm tired or broken. I don't recognize myself. The entries stopped abruptly, right around the time the divorce petition had been filed. I closed the notebook and rested my hand on the cover. I wasn't angry at that version of myself. I felt protective. She had been surviving something she didn't yet have language for. The next call came sooner than expected. Charges were being considered. Additional ones. The detective warned me gently that if this moved forward, there could be media interest. Questions. Speculation. I laughed once, quietly. "They already made their story about me once," I said. "I'm not afraid of it anymore." But I was cautious. For Leona's sake. We talked about privacy, about boundaries, about what to say if someone asked uncomfortable questions. She listened seriously. Then she said, "If people are mean, I don't have to explain, right?" "That's right," I said. "You don't owe anyone your story." That night, after she fell asleep, I sat alone in the dark living room. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by someone else's narrative. How carefully that narrative had been built. How easily it had almost worked. And how close I had come to losing everything simply because I trusted someone who benefited from my silence. I realized then that survival wasn't the end of the story. Truth was. And truth has a way of expanding, of reaching into places you thought were settled. The past wasn't finished with me. But this time, it wasn't coming from a place of power. It was coming from accountability. And I wasn't the one being questioned anymore. I was the one who already knew the answers. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. "We need to talk." I didn't respond. I didn't block it either. Because whoever sent it didn't realize something crucial. Silence wasn't my weakness anymore. It was my choice. And choices change everything. The message stayed unanswered for 3 days. "We need to talk." No name. No context. Just a reminder that the past still believed it could summon me on command. On the 4th day, I received another call from the detective. The investigation had moved faster than expected. Bank records had confirmed intent. Shell accounts traced. A pattern established that went beyond personal betrayal and crossed cleanly into criminal design. Darius wasn't just losing credibility. He was losing protection. They asked if I would be willing to provide a final statement, one that closed the loop. Not for evidence. For record. For clarity. I agreed. When I sat across from the recorder this time, my voice didn't shake. I didn't rehearse. I didn't try to sound composed. I just told the truth. I talked about the erosion, the quiet manipulation, the way reality had been bent until I doubted my own instincts. I explained how systems can be weaponized when the wrong people learn how to perform stability. When I finished, the detective turned the recorder off and said something simple. "You saved more than yourself." I didn't respond, because saving myself had been hard enough. The unknown number texted again that night, this time longer. Apologies, explanations, claims of pressure, of bad influence, of mistakes. I read it once. Then I deleted it. Some conversations don't deserve a response. Leona noticed the shift before anyone else did. She always did. "You look lighter," she said one morning as we walked to school. "I am," I answered honestly. A month later, the news broke quietly. No dramatic headlines. No spectacle. Just legal notices, sealed filings, and one short article buried on the third page of a business section. Charges expanded. Sentencing revised. Assets frozen permanently. The world moved on quickly. I didn't need it to pause. What mattered had already changed. The last legal document arrived by mail on an ordinary afternoon. I opened it at the kitchen counter while soup simmered on the stove. One page. Official language. Finality. It was done. I folded the paper, slid it into a folder, and placed it on the shelf where old things go to rest. That night, Leona asked if we could plant something on the balcony. "Something that stays," she said. We bought a small lemon tree the next weekend. Planted it together. Dirt under our nails. Sun on our backs. She pressed the soil down carefully and looked up at me. "It's going to take a long time to grow," she said. "I know. That's okay." I smiled. So much of my life had been about urgency, about reacting, about bracing. Now I understood the power of slow growth, of stability built without fear, of a future that didn't need to be defended every day. Later, when the apartment was quiet and the city lights flickered beyond the window, I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of this story. She had been afraid. She had been silenced. But she had listened. She had watched. She had remembered. And when the moment came, she stood. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. I no longer measure my life by what I escaped. I measure it by what I chose. And every day I choose truth, safety, and the kind of love that doesn't demand my disappearance. Leona slept peacefully in the next room. The lemon tree rested in its pot, roots settling. And for the first time in years, nothing was waiting to take something from me. That is not luck. That is what happens when silence ends and control changes hands. If my story stayed with you, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who may need strength more than they realize.